Hi, I'm Kelly Fordon. I'm here today with Susan Perabo, and we are talking about a story from her collection, Why They Run the Way They Do. And the story is called This Is Not That Story. Hi, Susan. Thank you for being on the
Hi,
podcast.
Kelly. Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
I'm so excited to talk about this story because, well, first I want to ask you about, I guess, the central themes of the collection itself, and then we'll get into the story. But the story is such a great story for writers that I'm really excited to talk about it. So what is the central theme of this collection?
I didn't think that there was a central theme to this collection when I was writing these stories. These stories I wrote over a lot of years. It really is a collection in that way, a collection of work that I wrote over 10 or 12 years when my kids were little. I didn't have a lot of time to write, and I was also, I've got a full-time teaching job. And so I wrote a story or so a year. And so these stories are written at very different times of my writerly life and personal life. And so, yeah, I didn't think that there was a unifying theme. However, I will say that after I put all the stories together, I realized, and this is relevant for our discussion today, I realized how many of the stories are about stories. I think that that is something that I am really interested in, professionally and personally, is how we define ourselves with stories, and how the stories that we tell about ourselves and about our lives uh, really dictate who we end up being and where we end up going. And so I think that, if there is a theme, I would say that if not a theme, that's something at least that comes back repeatedly in the stories, I would say. What do you think?
Well, I was thinking that I thought the same thing. There's a lot about stories, but then when I was looking at the title, Why They Run the Way They Do, and I was thinking that it does have to do with stories, whether you run from the story, whether you're trying to tell the story straight on, whether you're trying to tell it from a peripheral standpoint. But there were quite a few stories about how to tell the story, which I thought was fascinating. So it's a great collection for writers to read in general, I think, because there's so much emphasis on that, like how best to convey the story in terms of getting some deeper meaning about the story.
Yeah, I think that I mean, that's the question that I'm always asking myself as a writer, and that I think all writers are asking themselves. And what's interesting about this story we're going to talk about today, which I just reread and I hadn't read in some time, it's one of the stories from the collection that's older, that I wrote many years ago, is that that I'm kind of trying to work that out as the story progresses. That the story is really, this is not that story as a meditation on trying to find meaning in stories. And so I think that it sort of speaks for the whole book, and maybe all the work that I've ever done is kind of, this process of trying to figure out, okay, in this, and that most story writers are trying to figure out, in this vast scope that I'm looking at, what is the thing that I can dig deeply into, in this short space, and illuminate for the reader in a way that is meaningful and resonate.
Yeah, and it seemed like in that story, it's a story about a boy who dies. And even, when I was in college, there was a boy who killed himself like the first week of college. And then you don't know anything else about the story. I mean, we never got his backstory. We never knew where he was from. So I was thinking a lot about him when I was reading this story. And so I'm curious about, when you first started writing this story, what did you first think it would be about? And then how did it evolve into the current format that you have?
Yeah, it's one thing I love about this show and conversation that you do, is that I think it gets at the fact that stories, even from a single writer, even from a single period of that writer's life, all stories grow and in different ways, that there's no, I mean, that every story's seed is a surprise, I feel like, and that I've never known a writer who says, here's my process and here's how I go about it every single time. For me, it's just wildly different every time. And so when somebody, asks a question at a reading, like, where do you get your ideas or something like that, it's like, I have no good answer to that because it's so different for every single story. But this story started out not even as a story. This story started out as, I would say, almost an exercise or a meditation on storytelling. And I wrote it because, and you mentioned your own experience with this at college, and I think that sadly, a lot of us have had an experience like that where a student dies and there are rumors and people who know people who know people or whatever, but you don't ever really know the true story. You didn't know the person in a lot of cases. So this happened at my college on our campus maybe a dozen years ago, and maybe more than that now. And I wanted to, the students that I was teaching at the time were obviously troubled by it and wanted to talk about it and wanted to kind of figure out ways to deal with it artistically, right? Ways to think about it in and ways to use writing to kind of grapple with it. And I wanted to do that too. I mean, and I figured, that this is sort of the essential question, or one of the essential questions of art, is like, how do we use it to soothe ourselves, to comfort ourselves, to relieve ourselves, and also to explore what we can't ever know and what we can't understand. And so I wrote this story sort of along with my students. I didn't share it with them, at least not immediately, but I wrote it sort of as my own grappling with what they were grappling with. And I didn't think about it as a story. Like I didn't think I was writing a short story. I thought I was writing an essay, or again, like a meditation or just an exploration. I didn't know what it was. And there's that long thing at the end where I just kind of go off as like the teacher, like, this would be a great exercise in a fiction workshop. And, there's all the questions that it tries to ask. So I thought, well, that's not a story. But then when I was done with it, I felt like it got somewhere or did something or was able, in its not storyness, it was able to kind of get to some kernel of, if not truth, at least meaning in the ways in which all those lives were connected. So I submitted it to a magazine and I called it a story, and it was published, and my editor really liked it and wanted to put it in the collection. But it still, for me, kind of stands out as a story that, even though it's called This Is Not That Story, it could almost be called This Is Not a Story, because I don't know if it is. I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. So what do you think? Is it a story?
Don't know. I think it's a story about an artist grappling with how to tell the story of something that happened. But then on a deeper level, I feel like it is about connection too, and how, well, I was going to talk about this later, but I'll just talk about it now since we're into it. The idea of the tag-alongs. And I thought that is so fascinating. So it happens in section 2. And in that section, there's this young man who hosts the party and his kind of girlfriend. And he starts thinking about how, there were the inevitable tag-alongs and the tag-alongs of tag-alongs coming to his party. And later it occurred to me that a tag-along, everyone is a tag-along in someone's story. And sometimes you're the peripheral person, and sometimes you're, the protagonist, you're the crucial element of the story. But every tag-along is affected by that to some degree, like there's the tag-along who's who's the groundskeeper. I mean, he's the newest member of the crew, but he's also the oldest, and he's going to be in section 1. His wife says she feared that seeing the boy would remind her husband of all the things he had seen and worked so hard to forget, all the other things they've been running from for so many years. So in a way I was like, okay, well, he's the guy who's running, who would run from the story, who's running. And then the second section, the guy who's hosting the party is the one who just gets caught by the story. He's just there, and he has to pay the price just for being the bystander. So anyway, that whole concept of the tag-alongs, I thought, well, this is a story about how connected we are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And about the fact, like you said, that anybody can be the main character, depending on where you focus the camera, right? That a tag along becomes a main character, one, by what that tag along does, and in this case, horribly, the tag along dies, right? I mean, that he becomes the center of the story. This kid who's just somebody, some nameless person at a party to the young man, becomes the center of the story. And so partly that's how, that's how somebody becomes the central character. But also that the story, I think, gets at this idea that depending on who we look at, depending on who the writer chooses to look at, everybody is the central character, right? Every one of those 5 or 4 people who are focused on for a few pages in the story, that could be a whole story, and that person could be the central character, but it's just because of what has happened, that person becomes peripheral in the story. Even though if we followed, I had a good friend read this story before I published it, a great writer, and one of my best readers, and he said, man, I love that groundskeeper. I was sorry when the story shifted. I wanted to follow the groundskeeper. I wanted to know where all that led. And so I had this moment of like, maybe that is the story. I mean, like I was sort of living out what happens in the story in real life. It's like, maybe, okay, so maybe that is the story, and maybe I should follow that. And maybe this isn't the story about the boy dying and the college kids. Maybe they're just part of his story. And so, yeah, I love that idea. And I loved how you described it, that we're all kind of, tag-alongs and minor characters in each other's stories, and it's just a question of the moment that the writer chooses to play out, whether or not we end up being featured or whether or not we're just somebody at the party.
When you were first writing it, you just wrote it this way?
I just wrote it this way. Yeah. And again, like in my head, I sort of traveled down the road a little bit further, but because when I wrote it, I didn't even think it was a story. I just thought it was an exercise for me, for my students, for just kind of trying to make sense of this situation. I wasn't thinking about it in those terms. So it wasn't until afterwards, like I said, then I had this friend read it, that I thought, oh, maybe the whole thing was just an exercise to get me to that groundskeeper, and he's the story. But then I decided, no, I think it is a story about stories, and that's okay. And I just have to let it be that.
The other thing I was thinking was that it's kind of like a story about the fall, like a fall from grace, a fall from innocence. It was just interesting to me in the first section, when the groundskeeper arrives, it's still snowing. He arrives in his dirty white truck, which, like in my mind was just conflating with the snow and making me think about dirty snow, so it was kind of cool that it was a dirty white truck. So he arrives at 6:15, and that's after the fall, and just the word dirty is there, so it's afterwards. But in the second section, there's all sorts of stuff about how the man who's hosting the party feels before the fall, and I love this line: they were at a wonderful stage immediately preceding panic, when life after graduation is far enough off that it seems any number of breathtaking opportunities might arise before then. and his applications are out. And then it says, this was the time between possibilities and choices when he could relax. It was also the last time he would secretly believe that anything was possible. And it just reminds me, I don't know if you've ever read like the Michael Byers story, The Beautiful Days.
Mm-mm.
It was in Best American, probably like in 2000. But it's also about a college kid and a fall from grace and how you can never go back. He also, will think about on that last night. And I love the way none of them have names. So they're all sort of like these archetypal characters. Later, when he looked back on this night, this would be the moment he would remember most clearly, the moment when he should have said something meaningful, should have said, what about next summer, or what about next year, or at least told her how beautiful she looked sitting there on that wall. Instead, he said beer. And it's so true that you don't realize it's the last time you're going to be able to do something like that.
Yeah, and it sounds weird to say that I enjoyed writing those characters because it was a tragic situation that the story stemmed from. But I really did, I spend so much time with college students, crazy amount of time, and I'm kind of in that world, but I'm also really outside that world. I mean, obviously, I had my own experience, and so I can think back on that, but just to be able to kind of go back to that place where I see them, and how each year of college, you really do see, these students going through these very similar kinds of things. And as seniors, when it just is starting to, when they're really torn between this kind of panic of, oh my God, the real world, but also, oh my God, the real world, and it's just, it's a beautiful thing to watch. And part of what made that section so sad is that, that he has this moment there where he's living in that, and then because of something that he has no control over, that moment is kind of taken away from him. But yeah, I liked being a part of that time in their lives.
So then section 3, we go on to like the chaplain. And I thought that was really fascinating. Like, I don't know if you meant the chaplain to be like kind of a doppelganger for a writer, but like the way that the chaplain's like, if only I could unload this story, if I could only tell them, then it will be over for me. The burden will be lifted or whatever. He's thinking about what the father's thinking, and he's deciding like, well, the son is probably tucked away in the father's brain. He's at this conference and no one can reach them. I also thought that was interesting part about how the world has changed. You would never go 7 hours without being able to reach someone now.
I thought that as I was reading it this morning, I thought, wow, 7 hours, that's way too long. And then I was like, yeah, but they didn't have cell phones.
No, so. I know, it's so wild. The chaplain at the very end of his section, he finally gets an answer on the phone and he's like, oh my God, what was I thinking? I thought this would all end. I just was curious what you were thinking about that section, what that character was doing in your mind.
Yeah, it's interesting that what you say about it being like writerly. I didn't intend that, but you're right, absolutely. That this idea of trying to get a story out, trying to kind of free yourself of that knowledge and that understanding, and then once it's out there, the moment it's out there, you're thinking, wait, no, I want it back. I want it back. It's not ready to be shared. This news is not ready for the world. And he feels that in a very personal way, obviously, because of this tragedy. But yeah, that's an interesting way of reading it. And I think that even if I didn't intend it, because the whole story is about stories and about telling, I think it fits right in. What struck me, what I thought about when I was writing it, and I thought about it again as I was reading it, is just this terrible power of knowledge and of knowing things that will change. This idea that, that you have a secret, or if not a secret, yeah, just a piece of information that that is so, that is so essential to someone's life, that you can't believe that you hold it and that they don't, and that just it feels very uncomfortable for him. And as a parent, that I think that's one thing that we all, obviously we all worry about our kids 24/7, right? No matter how old your kids are. And just this idea that things that we don't know are happening, and that we can't know until somebody tells us. I mean, it's just it's an uncomfortable fact. It sounds obvious, but it's an uncomfortable fact of being alive, that things that are going to change us sometimes we don't know about until 2 hours or 4 hours or 6 hours or a day or 3 days later, that something awful can happen or something wonderful can happen, and we're still in the dark. So the thing exists out in the world already, but we're still part of the old world where it hasn't happened yet. I think I'm fascinated by that. The fact that the chaplain holds that knowledge and that power, even though obviously if he doesn't tell them, somebody else is going to tell him. But the weight of that knowledge, that he's about to take the son out of that place he's tucked into in his father's brain and move him somewhere else forever, is just overwhelming.
I mean, it reminds me a little bit of the hero's journey, the way that, a person going along their life and then something happens out of the blue and then the story begins there. But in
Right.
this case, the chaplain is thinking, well, the story will end here when I tell them. For
Mm-hmm.
me, if you're telling a story from the chaplain's perspective, it's supposed to
Right.
end there. Yeah.
Yeah, it does end for him, and that it's not that it's not that the chaplain will forget, but obviously once this burden is off him of the telling, then it becomes somebody else's burden. And that also, I think, is, you can bring that back to stories as well, right? That once that a story is so entirely yours, and I'm sure you've had this experience as a writer, where a story that you're writing seems so real and so complete and so fully realized. You have the thought, but nobody has seen it but me. Like, it exists, but it also doesn't exist, right? That like, as long as it's just you and just what's on the page that's come from you and nobody else has looked at it, it's sort of like a tree falling in the forest, right? I mean, it's just it really and the moment the story has eyes on it besides yours, it exists in a different way, right? It's not yours anymore, because the reader is going to do with the story what the reader is going to do with the story, and you can't, you don't have that power, you don't have that control over it anymore. And the information, becomes public, and that's a strange feeling.
And he's right too. I mean, and it's not going to be less of a burden when that happens. It's going to be interesting and,
Right.
you know, but it could be interesting in a bad way or a good way, but there's going to
Yeah.
be some sort of reaction that's going to emanate from that moment.
Right. Yeah. And the burden shifts, right? I mean, the burden changes. What the burden is different, but it's still a burden.
Still
Yeah.
burden, yeah. So the RA, and this was an interesting part where I was thinking a lot about storytelling. So she's the last person to see him alive, but the conversation is utterly dull. And this is a point where I was thinking, if the writer were writing a story about, not writing a story about a story, but writing the story,
Right.
they would, of course, fill in and make it much more interesting. And she even says that, I wish I told the story a
Mhm.
million times and I wish I had something else to say. And even the part about the fact that he's not wearing any shoes, you would fill in some explanation for that if you were telling a fictional story.
Yeah. And that's, that's another interesting thing that I was hoping to get at in the story, which is that is not a story, which is that most of the things, that make a scene dramatic, um, that we as fiction writers, you know, uh, uh, rely on when we build scenes, um, uh, those things rarely happen organically in real life. That most of our dialogue is pretty dull, and we don't talk about meaningful things, except very, very occasionally. And that and you talked about this in that earlier section too, with the young man wishing that he had said something profound, or at least something kind, or something meaningful, um that you never know when those scenes are that you're going to go back to in your mind, right? I mean, that goes back to this idea of we can never know. Am I the main character now? Is this the big scene? Is this the climactic moment? um when we build a story, we know all those things, so we know that, yeah, okay, this is the climactic moment between this boy who's about to die and this young woman, and so something of meaning should pass between them. They should get into it, they should talk about stuff. um and that as a writer, but you never know that as a person. You never know what the big scenes are because there's no music in the background, and you don't know how many minutes have passed in the movie, right? And so you don't know where you are in the arc of the story. And so you just say dumb stuff. You just ask people for cigarettes, and talk about the weather. And that drives her crazy when she thinks back on it. But that how was she to know? She had no chance of knowing that moment was going to matter as much as it did.
Yeah, and it's interesting because in ending this, or having that happen and having, not answering the story or the question about his shoes and not having them discuss everything, I suddenly realized, wow, that is what I turn to fiction for. I want that writer, the writer, whoever I'm reading, to close that gap, to give me
Yeah.
an answer that I've been looking for. I mean, it's weird in not answering it, you answered the question of like, why do I read fiction? Well, I read it because I want the answer.
Right. You want to know why he doesn't have shoes on, and you don't want me just spitballing like, well, maybe it's this or maybe it's that. Hell, I don't know. No, you want to know. You're right. That's what's unsatisfying about real life is we don't ever know why people don't have their shoes on, unless we ask them. And if we don't think to ask them, then we may never find out. And that's the question that stories are supposed to answer for us, because art is supposed to make sense of things that don't make sense, right? And make order out of chaos, like John Cheever said. um because because we crave that. We want things to make sense. We want things to add up.
And I always told my children that too before they, they've now started reading now that they're older, but they used to just watch movies. And I'd always say, well, in the movie, you can see the person move around, but in the story, you can see what they're thinking, also, which is so fascinating also in this story because, we know what the chaplain's thinking. We don't really know what I mean, we know a little bit about what the groundskeeper's thinking, but we don't know if he suddenly harkens back to his
Mhm.
earlier traumatic. We know what his wife's thinking.
Yeah.
We know what the RA is thinking, but we don't know what the boy's thinking. And like, that's just a conscious choice that you made as a writer,
Right.
because that's the point that, you know,
Yeah.
yeah, this is not
Yeah.
this.
And I did, I did think about that. It is his point of view one. Does his point of view in the story? I mean, is that where we end up? That was a really important choice for me. And that was when the story became more about the writer, as you said, than about the character. Because I think that, I don't know, I've never thought about this before, but just now I'm thinking that if the story had been entirely fabricated, like if I had just thought, what if a kid on a college campus died? I might have been more tempted to go into his point of view and end the story in his head. But because this was a young man whom I did not know, but who I knew people who knew him. And again, this is not his family. This is not his, most of the story is made up, as I say. But I think that I felt like it wasn't my place to do that. And that I didn't want to, that there's some perspectives that you just say, that doesn't belong to me. I don't say that about much as a writer. I mean, as a writer, I'm sort of like, anything goes. But because of the personal connection, I felt like that was not my place to do. And again, as you said, I think what I realized when writing this was that this is a story about writing. It's not a story about this person or even this situation. It's a story about writing. And so it made sense to end with sort of my meditation on what it meant, but then at the end to come back to him, because it is his story. That is the story. This boy died. The story's not about me, and it's not about any of those other characters. It's about the boy who died. But because I don't know him, and because I choose not to explore him, the story circles around him, but never intersects.
I love this last paragraph. I could just read. Is it okay to read it?
Sure.
Okay. The truth escapes me. People say, those surely we are willing accomplices to its flight. We loosened its chains, leave its cell door slightly ajar, allow ourselves to become distracted as it lumbers off into the waning light. It's easier that way, for then everything and everyone is fair game. Yes, this story is possibilities for a fiction workshop, or an exercise in character and plot, in beginnings, in endings, a study in POV, a story about a college, about a generation, about a culture of excess, a tale about the splintering of friendships, about priorities, about the weight of the past, the weight of the future, the weight of the single moment, and how it resonates through dorm rooms and classrooms, into bedrooms and waiting rooms. This story could be all those things, yet it is none of them. So what then is the story? Only this: a boy died. And I was thinking about that line, the famous line about, what's the story? The story is the king died and died of grief. I don't remember.
Mm-hmm.
And but it's true. It is only this: a boy died, and yet it is also a story about all the tag-alongs to the story.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah. The central fact of the story is a boy died, but everything that surrounds it is its own story.
Mm-hmm. And could be taken in any different direction.
Right.
Yeah. Well, it's an amazing story. Is there anything I didn't cover in the story that you wanted to talk about?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, good. That's good. All right. Well, I loved this story so much, and I really appreciate you talking to me.
Thank you.
What are you working on now? I'm just curious.
I'm working on stories. I'm also working on novels, so I'm doing both simultaneously. I got a lot of writing done during the pandemic. Strangely, I don't know.
You're lucky, because
I don't know if it's this way for you, but I know for most people that is not the case. My children are of an age of self-sufficiency, and so I had a lot of good family time with them, being home for much of the last year, but also I had some chunks of time to write that were kind of unexpected, and so I wrote a lot of stories. I wrote a lot of new stories, and started working on novels. So yeah,
that's fantastic. That's great. Anything we can look for? Anything coming out in Literary Journal?
Yeah, I just had a story come out in Story Magazine, the most recent issue of Story Magazine, or the spring issue. There may be another one out right now, just out, but the spring issue of Story, and I had a story up on Oprah Daily, which is the website that is formerly Oprah Magazine, or O Magazine. It's now all electronic, and so
I read that one, and The Seventh Garden.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that story.
Oh, thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I even joined Oprah just to read it. So
Really?
yes,
Wow. Well,
I
thank
know.
you.
Yeah.
I told people, I posted about it on Facebook and I was like, if they make you join, like, please just wait a few weeks because it'll probably be free. I
Yeah.
think that's how it works. It's like exclusive for a while and then eventually anybody
Yeah, I
can.
didn't know. I don't know why. I just was like, okay, I'll just
Well,
join.
thank you.
I
And
like Oprah too, so I thought
I
I'll do
do
that.
too. And I'll tell you also, they're doing great fiction. I mean, they're publishing, I don't know if it's every Sunday, but I think it's maybe 2 Sundays a month they're publishing new stories. And they've got a lot of really, really good writers. So I was very happy to be included in that. And yeah, I think it's worth the price, whatever it is.
I do too. I do too. Well, thank you so much. It was great talking with you.
Yep, fantastic. Thank you. And thanks for doing this because I think this is such, as I said earlier, I think this is such a important. And I guess when Caitlin Horrocks did it, she said something like, I'm friends with her on Facebook, and maybe she said this on Twitter, I can't remember, but she said something like, "This one's for the nerds," and I was like, "Yeah, right on."
I
Like
know.
I love story nerds. I love like getting into the the choices and the questions that only only kind of deep reading and deep thinking about can get you to. So I think you're doing a great service for writers and for students of writing, and that's all of us, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
thanks.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you. I hope we get a chance to talk again soon.